Hi, I wanted to make a quick video, hopefully quick, with some review for the test that you've got coming up this week. It's going to be on equations and inequalities. You've been doing a good job with these lessons, but there's a couple of things I want to make sure that I go over. First of all, fast facts about your test. It's 14 questions, 12 of them will be multiple choice, and then you do have 2 short answer, which I am going to go over and kind of give you some hints and some pointers on those 2 short answer questions at the end of the video. So these review notes, this worksheet that I'm writing on, I'm going to also upload it and attach it to this video so that you can print it, you can use it as a notes sheet. I'm going to give you a blank one so that you can practice these notes with me, and I'm going to give you the one that I write on, so hopefully that will work and you can also see the examples. So the first thing that I want to review is factoring. Factoring and the distributive property go together. Factoring is essentially undoing the distributive property. So to review, distributive property is when you distribute your number or outside the parentheses, multiplying it to everything inside the parentheses. So to simplify this, we would get 4x squared minus 12x plus 20. So then factoring, you're looking for the number or number and variable combo that will go into all of your terms. Those are the things that are separated by the plus and minus signs, your terms. It will go into each one of those evenly. This example that I'm going to go over is very similar to the essay question. So pay close attention to this. When you are factoring this, there's a couple different things that you can do. So I'm going to show you 2 different ways that I would factor this. So first of all, looking at our whole numbers, our coefficients, 18, 12, 36. I want to think of a number that goes into each of those evenly. There are at least 2. I'm going to use 2. And then I'm also going to look at my variables. I've got x to the third, x to the second, and x. That means x will go into each one of those. So I'm going to put a 2x outside, and then I'm going to divide each of the terms by 2x. 18 divided by 2 is 9. X goes into x to the third. That would leave me x squared. When you divide, it's going to cancel out an x. Then 2 would go into 12 6 times. So I'm keeping the sign, minus 6. X to the square divided by x is just x. And then 36 divided by 2 is 18. X divided by x would be 1. So I don't need to write anything. So that is one way to factor this. I'm pulling out a 2 and an x. Another way to factor it is if you look at 18, 12, and 36 and think, oh, 6 goes into all of those evenly, and you don't even worry about the variables. You can also divide each of them by 6. So 18 divided by 6 would give me 3x to the third minus 2x squared plus 6x. That's another way that you could factor that. So that's just 2 examples of factoring. Unless the instructions say factor by the greatest common factor, you can factor using either one of these. So one of your essay questions is going to ask you what's a different way that you can factor it. This is an example of that. I'm factoring it in 2 different ways. You're just looking for a number or variable that goes into everything. Now, solving multi-step equations. This is going to be a big chunk of your exam because these steps you can also use for solving multi-step inequalities. So I'm not going to read through this whole chart, so you can pause the video, you can print this, you can use this, but it's step-by-step what you should do. I will say inverse operations, super important when you're solving equations. That means if you've got like plus 5, the inverse would be subtracting 5. If you've got multiplied by 6, the inverse would be to divide by 6. I'll talk about that when I do the examples. But this whole table, step by step, with some hints on how you could solve that. So we've got one solution, no solution, and infinite solutions. I thought this was important to talk about because it is on your test, and some of you were a little confused by this when you were doing the quizzes for this lesson. So when you have variables on both sides of the equal sign, you can either get one solution, which would be like x equals 5, x equals -2. That's one number, one solution, or no solution. And that means there's not a number you can plug in for the variable that's going to make it true. And then infinite solutions means there's lots of different numbers that you could plug in. In fact, infinity solutions that you could plug in and that would make it true. So you need to think of solutions as things that make the equation true or work. So I'm going to talk about that in each of these examples. So I'm also going to solve each of these using the steps in this table. So step 1, distribute. I do have some parentheses here, so I'm going to distribute first. So that's going to give me 3x plus 12. Write the rest of your problem. Hopefully I can fit all of this in my box here. The second step, combining like terms. If there are no like terms to combine, you'll just skip to the next step. I do have some like terms here. I have positive 12 and -2 on this side. And on the other side, I have 7x and -2x. So I'm going to combine those like terms. Combining does not mean using inverse operations. You just kind of look at that side and do each side separately. So on this side, I would have 3x plus 10, 12 minus 2. And on the other side, 7x minus 2x is 5x, and I have minus 6. Step 3, get all the variables on one side. My hint that I gave you here was you use inverse operations, and I always move the smaller coefficient, the smaller number. So for this problem, I'm going to move the 3x. So subtract 3x from each side. That's going to give me 10 is equal to 2x minus 6. Step 5, we move the constants. Constants are numbers that are by themselves, no variable. Inverse would be to add 6 to each side. So 16 equals 2x. Step 5, you move the coefficient or the number in front of the variable. This would be 2 times x, so the inverse would be to divide both sides by 2. And we get that 8 equals x, or x equals 8. It's one solution. There's one answer, and that answer is 8. If I plug in 8 where the x is, I would get something that equals each other, so it's true. So the next example of no solution, again, we're going to follow our steps. Step 1, distribute. There's no parentheses, so I can skip to the next step, which is combine like terms. I do have some like terms here, 5t and -2t, so I'm going to combine those. 5t minus 2t is 3t, plus 4 equals 3t minus 7. The next step, get all the variables on one side. Again, moving the smaller one, but if you notice here, they're the same. So if I subtract 3t from each side, the 3t's will cancel each other out, and I get 4 is equal to -7. 4 does not equal -7. So that right there tells me when I get something like this, a number equaling a number that's not true, that is not true, so this must be no solution. That's your clue that nothing is going to work. There's no number I can plug in that is going to make 4 equal to -7. So no solution. So anytime you get your variables canceling each other out, look closely at your numbers. If they are equal, that's going to be the next example. But if they're not equal, no solution. So the example for infinite solutions, again, following the steps in our table, distribute first. I do have some parentheses, so I'm going to distribute that. So 8f plus 6 is equal to 8f plus 6. Interesting. You should notice something about that. So now if I subtract 8f from each side, this is getting all the variables on one side, the f's cancel out and I get 6 is equal to 6. That is true. So that means no matter what I plug in for f, the two sides are always going to be equal to each other. So that's where the infinite solutions comes into play. So you may have a test question that gives you a equation to solve, and instead of having answers, it will say, does this equation have one solution, no solution, or infinite solutions? You need to solve it and then figure it out from there. If you actually get a number, it's one solution. If you get something that's not equal, no solution. And if you get two numbers, no variables, then it's infinite. All right. So moving on to solving multi-step inequalities, you follow the exact same steps that we just talked about for equations, but if you multiply or divide by a negative, here's when you have to switch the sign, and that means you're switching the direction that your sign is facing. So if it's a less than and you multiply or divide by a negative, you switch it to greater than. So I'm going to quickly run through these three examples. If you look at the problem here, I do have a -4, so that's something I want to look out for. Following the same steps, no distributive property, no like terms, the variables aren't on different sides, so I'm going to start with moving the constant. So I'm subtracting 8 from each side, and I get 3r is less than or equal to -4. Divide both sides by 3. Please notice that I'm dividing by 3. I am not, sorry, this should be -12. Wrote down the wrong thing. Note that I'm dividing by 3, not by a -3. The negative's on top, but I'm not dividing by it. So I don't switch the sign on this one. So your final answer would be r is less than or equal to -4. So even though there is a negative, I didn't divide by that negative. I divided by a positive, so you don't switch the sign. On the second example, adding 3 to each side, you would get w over -4 is less than 5. Now to get w by itself, this is w divided by -4, so I need to multiply both sides by -4. I am multiplying by a negative here, so I do want to switch the sign. So this would be w is greater than, I'm switching the direction the sign is pointing, -20. The last example I've got here, again, distribute first. So -2, that would be -2b plus 4. Watch your negatives there. Negative times a negative is positive. Greater than or equal to -4. Subtract 4 from each side. That's going to give me -2b is greater than or equal to -8. Again, I'm not changing the sign yet because I'm subtracting. Subtracting doesn't switch the sign. Divide both sides by -2, and we get b is less than or equal to 4. I'm switching the sign here because I divided by the negative, right? Moving on to solving multi-step equations or inequalities with exponents or square roots. This was the very last lesson you did. My hints here, save the step of taking the square root for last. That should be the absolute last thing that you do. And don't forget, when you take the square root, there's always two answers, positive root and a negative root. So you can use a calculator on your test as well, but your calculator is always going to give you the positive root. So you've got to remember in your head, two answers, positive and a negative. So for this problem, I would add 8 to both sides. Again, you can use a calculator. 5x squared would be equal to 125. Divide both sides by 5. X squared is equal to 25. Here's where you would take the square root. Again, I'm saving this for last. Take the square root of both sides, and for your answer, you would say x is equal to 5 and -5. The reason for that is 5 times 5 is 25. But also, if I do -5 times -5, it's also equal to 25. That's why there's two answers when you're taking a square root. So, essay questions. The first essay question that you're going to have is a factoring comparison. It's going to give you 3 students, and it's going to say, did each of these students factor correctly? Yes or no? Explain. You can, my hint, use the distributive property to check if each student factored it correctly. So you're going to get a student's work. If you factor that student's work, it should get you back to the original problem. If it doesn't, they probably didn't factor correctly. So that's a way that you can check. You're also going to have to do something different than the students did. So look back at that first example I gave you with factoring about how you can use different numbers. All right. The second essay question, you're going to have to solve a linear inequality. Then you need to explain how to graph using words because you're typing. All right. So you have to use your words. I recommend actually graphing it yourself and then looking at your graph and then typing, how did I graph that? And then lastly, on that essay question, you'll give 2 examples. So I've got 2 examples here just to kind of show you what those words would be. So let's say you solve the inequality and you get x is less than 4. The words typed out, how you would describe how to graph that, would be an open circle. It's an open circle because there's no equal to sign under your inequality. At 4, that's our answer. And then you would shade to the left. You're shading to the left because it's less than. All right, so that would be the middle part of explaining how to graph using words. And then possible solutions, you would just give me 2 answers that are less than 4. So one is 3, one is -2. There's tons of different answers you can give me. As long as they fit for x, it'll work. All right. Now, another example, b is greater than or equal to 19. This is a closed circle because I do have that equal to. That means it can be 19, but it's also everything greater than 19. So you would do your closed circle at 19, shade to the right, right? And then possible solutions, it could be 19, it could be equal to 19, or any number that's greater than that. So 25, 100, 1,000,000, 2,000, lots of different examples. So don't get tripped up on, oh, I don't know what the 2 solutions are. It can be lots of different answers. I'm not looking for 2 specific ones. I'm just looking for numbers that fit into your inequality, right? I know this is a little long, sorry, but I hope it's helpful, all right? You don't have to watch it all in one setting. Hopefully you can pause it, print this. I hope it's helpful. Please email me if you've got questions, and good luck on your test.